Right. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to Trending Treasury, which is our weekly webcast from Arling Close. For those of you who haven't joined us before, can you just make sure that your microphone is muted and that your camera's off? Not because we don't want to hear from you or see you, just simply because it tends to mean that the connection's a bit more stable for all of the participants. If you do have any questions, then we do definitely encourage them. Please do use the chat box provided, and we'll come to them as we go along. Today I'm joined by Arnab Das, who is a strategist, or chief strategist, sorry, at Invesco. Arnab, thanks for joining us. Were you as foolish as I was and stayed up into the small hours of the other night? Or did you sensibly go to bed and wait until the morning?
I tried to stay up late, and then I sort of threw in the towel and said, this is going to run into a couple of late nights. And indeed, here we are.
Yeah. So I mean, I suppose that's the place to start, isn't it? I think when we agreed to do this webcast, I suspect you thought, well, it'll all be done and dusted by then, and you'll have lots to say. But actually, I think we've probably all got the counts and the results on our second screen at the moment. So I suppose the first thing to go is, who's going to win? I mean, we've already had our first question, asking for our predictions. At the moment, it seems that Joe Biden is the favourite after significant wobbles. But where do we think this is going to end up? Obviously there's been talk of challenging counts in places like Wisconsin, and etc. But what's your view on where the likelihood of the result is going to be?
Yeah, so I think that is the only place to start. I guess it's pretty clear that the electoral college vote count will be called in favor of Joe Biden across many of the states, but that across many of the swing states, though not all, and that despite that, the president will continue to challenge, as he's already started to challenge, a number of the results and take a kind of bifurcated approach where he will, his campaign is trying to continue vote counts where he has something to gain and stop vote counts where he seems to have something to lose. So I think, it's pretty clear that the matter will go initially to the local courts and the state courts. And there's, I guess, some chance that it'll go up to the Supreme Court, although I would say that, it's not quite as clear a narrative as in the contested 2000 election, where it did end up in the Supreme Court because of recounts, right? I mean, what's at stake here is a little bit different in that it seems to be more about counting some votes and ruling out swaths of other votes. So that's a bit unusual. And I guess, there's some chance of a full-blown constitutional crisis. The distinction I would make is that if the president and his campaign follow the procedure in the courts and then accept that result, that is a legally contested outcome, for which we do have precedents, right? We've had in the year 2000, in the year 1876, but the kind of, let's say, extra legal process or kind of disruption, and of course this president is all about disruption, would be that he rejects the idea of a peaceful and legal transfer of power that has held since the tide election of 1800, and seeks to do something like not standing down. I don't think that is a major risk. I think it's a quite small risk, but I think it's one that we don't want to completely rule out. And I think the downside of that, volatility associated with that in the markets, and then sort of the American reputation would be significant. And I think it can't be ruled out, not just because the president himself has kind of hinted at that previously, but also because the Attorney General, William Barr, is one of the very few prominent lawyers in the United States today, and in modern times, indeed, who rejects kind of a core principle of American jurisprudence, which is Marbury versus Madison, 1803, which established the kind of authority, or put into practical force the authority of the Supreme Court to adjudicate on what is constitutional by other branches of the government, and sort of thereby establishing the co-equality of the court, the Congress, and the executive branch. And so William Barr in this context is one of those few people who believe that if, quote unquote, if the president does it, therefore it is legal. You could put it that way. And so I only bring up this kind of detail because I think it's important for that tail risk. I don't want to overstate it, but I don't want to completely rule it out, as I said. And I think, he was selected particularly for that purpose, or for that reason, right? That, since this is a president who sees himself as running against a quote unquote rigged system, that's the logic of a lot of what he has done and said throughout his term, including the selection of his attorney general. So I don't want to spend too much time on that. I just put that out there as kind of there's a legal process that we're going through now. The president is going to continue to do that, and then there is some risk that he might go this extra legal route. I don't think it'll get to that. I think cooler heads will prevail, and so I do think we're looking at a Joe Biden, Kamala Harris executive branch. But having said that, I would say this is far, obviously very far from an unalloyed victory for the Democrats. I think it's worth saying that there's a lot of winners and losers here. I think it's pretty clear that the Republicans have succeeded, and President Trump himself succeeded in sort of thwarting the expectations of the pollsters, as well as mobilizing important segments of votes that were not expected to be mobilized the first time around 2016, and less so perhaps this time around as well. So Latino votes, and I'm not just talking about Cuban Americans in Miami-Dade, in Florida, which you could sort of attribute to the Cuba policy reversal from President Trump, but also Texas and other states. And I would also say that, this is, as is well known by now, the highest turnout election in modern times, right, since the year 1900. And so, despite it being a high turnout election, that seems to have worked not for the Democrats, but for the Republicans in the general election, right, sort of down ballot. So it's a very divided country. We're going to have a very divided government. And I would say, kind of the question about the establishment within the Democratic Party is out there. Nancy Pelosi in particular, the Speaker of the House. The question is also out there about the science of psephology, right? Polling. What do we really know about what's going on the ground? But anyway, there's a host of issues. So wherever you want to take the conversation on the kind of political front, or the economy and economic policy, foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I found very striking, and unfortunately this shows how much of a nerd I am, perhaps, is that there's been a lot of rhetoric from President Trump and also from, I suppose you'd call them his outriders, the Trump supporters, about it being a rigged election, about there being electoral fraud in states. But then when you actually look at some of the appeals and some of the court filings that they started to put in, the actual legal questions they're putting in and the actual accusations they're making are extremely toned down. It's things like not being incorrect access for election monitorers, not saying that they didn't have access, just that the access wasn't correct. I mean, it seems to me that though the rhetoric is quite big, the actual legal avenues that they are practically taking does seem to point to them using, shall we say, rhetorical rather than legal devices. I don't know if you've got any insight into that side of things.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point, and I think it sort of fits with a lot of the style of the Trump presidency, right? That Americans, and you can hear from my accent that I'm partly American, at least. I think I'm what Theresa May called a citizen of nowhere, right? from India, grew up in the UK and the US, and sort of Indian and American and British by nationality. So I look at this from this sort of question from many different points of view and angles, I guess, and these kind of political and economic questions in general. And what I would say is that about this particular question about the disconnect between the vituperative rhetoric and the actual substance of what's going on is a hallmark of this administration, right? I think you see it in this idea of the tweets and the tweet storms, through the night in many cases. And yet, although there has been a lot of disruption of the international system and a lot of attacks on American institutions and checks and balances and the deep state, there's been, I would say, an effort to make that the story, to make the media and the Twitter sphere and even the markets focus, to at least to some extent, the markets focus on all of that as an almost diversionary tactic from the real story. And I think that is a like I say, I think it's a Trump kind of hallmark strategy, and so I think he's trying to show to society as a whole that he's a fighter. I think he's trying to establish his legacy in being that kind of fighting against the rigged system and standing up for the common man, yet maintaining this version of kind of bootstrap capitalism and freedom. And I think you see that in almost every walk of everything that he's done, including the management or mismanagement, if you like, of the pandemic, right? That there's this kind of bifurcated approach where there is a scientific process, but there's an undercutting of that, and a lot of at best mixed messaging, or rejecting the kind of system-based, establishment-based approach to what's going on, and striking out in a different direction, because I think his instincts have led him to conclude that ordinary people are fed up with the system. And I think there's maybe a lot in that, and I think that actually relates to this disconnect that we've now seen between the polls and the results in this election and in the previous election, and I would say in the Brexit referendum as well. There a lot of these things in some of the polls have been, a lot of the outcomes have been within the margin of error, although in this one they were not, right? The margin of lead for the Democrats and this expectation of a blue wave and this kind of almost landslide sort of level of support for Biden, proves to be a nail biter. Well, so the pollsters have clearly got it wrong, and there are probably a bunch of things going on in different places, lots of nuances and a lot of need to, in the fullness of time, to slice and dice the data. But I think there are a few sort of things that we can glean from what we know already, and that is that I think there is a systematic problem in gauging what's going on the ground with regards to the views of ordinary people. And I think that is, like I'm suggesting here, implying this is a theme that's running through at least the West, and I would say many emerging market countries as well, where some politicians and some, not even non-politicians like Trump himself, after all, he's not a politician in his first political role as president, have by instinct and by gut have sussed out what's going on balance, and been able to whip that up into an outcome that's very different than expected by the polling, right? By the people whose expertise and whose job it is to figure this stuff out. And in some respects as well, the betting odds, right? I mean, I think, there's an interesting kind of market element to this as well, that if you think that, if you take the Brexit referendum, the betting odds were heavily skewed in favor of Remain. And that was, to some extent, less heavily also in the 2016 Trump election and in this election, although it changed around a bit on the night. And I looked into this at the time of the Brexit referendum, and of course, the reason is that the betting odds are weighted by the amount of money that's being put to work. But if you look at the number of bets, they were heavily skewed towards Brexit. They were skewed, not heavily, but skewed towards Trump in 2016. And of course, it's impossible to separate the two completely because the polling results are an input into the way people place their bets. And of course, the odds themselves are an input into the way subsequently other bets are placed. So it's very hard to be precise about all of this. But I think what it does, sort of capture in a nutshell is this kind of, in a way, this problem of inequality. And I think it relates to everything in domestic politics and in geopolitics and in the challenges that we face in a globalized environment that that the big money, in a sense, is being put to work for a kind of establishment outcome, and the little folk, if you like, or the large number of bets with smaller amounts of money are being put to work on the kind of disruptive outcome. And so I think that captures the zeitgeist, if you like, in a nutshell, right? That we have this disconnect. And I think it concerns me that, we keep seeing this, and it's almost as if we're not learning from experience, right? We're going through this kind of Einstein definition of madness where we're doing the same thing and expecting a different result. And it may be that we're not capable with the existing polling techniques of getting to that shy Trump voter, or getting to those people who are not frequent voters, or getting to those people who don't have landlines but are on social media and so forth.
So, I mean, that seems to me that that's going to have a big effect on the way that investors and how the market positions itself. Because if as you point out, the polls are the polling techniques that we have now, the polling companies that we have now are not perhaps where we'd like them to be. Traditionally, the market has positioned itself and investors have positioned themselves based on where the polls are. Do we think that we'll see a lot more defensive positioning from market participants, or do we think that we'll see market participants doing their own polling, doing their own research, or what do you think the outcome will be for investors of how they will react to really big market-moving events like presidential elections or referenda?
Well, so I think in general, our view has been and continues to be, and kind of our advice for, or our suggestion for long-term investors would be, it's not the event of the election that matters, and trying to time that and trade it actively is very dangerous unless you're in the market, sort of full time as a professional, sort of high frequency investor. So as an asset allocator, or even a tactical, strategic, or even a tactical asset allocator, you probably want to take the long view and think about where policy is going rather than the individual political event, and try to build a sense of what the trend and the tendency in these political events is towards, rather than the individual event. But now, of course, if you are, a short-term investor, or a high-frequency, or a hedge fund, or a macro fund, of course, part of what you do is to time the market. And for those people, I think we've already seen a combination of all the things that you're suggesting as possibilities, and I think all those possibilities are out there, and depending on the investor category, will be taken. So I think in the Brexit referendum and the UK elections, in this election as well, in the US elections, there are people doing a lot of their own polling, or commissioning their own polling. And I think people who can spend the time and money on that will continue to do that. And I think they can, and they should, and they will, because I think they see that the politicians and the parties are doing that themselves, right? I mean, a lot of the punditry was sort of left scratching their heads about why President Trump went to Omaha. And of course, in retrospect, it sort of makes sense, right? Because there was an electoral vote there that was in play, and their polling suggested that they could get that, and maybe the average polling, the kind of the generally available polling, suggested otherwise. And so, I think when you sift through the details of all of these things that are going on, particularly in the US, the UK, and some other countries where there's a lot of information and a lot of data to sift through, notwithstanding that some of the analytical flaws and failures that have occurred, when there's a lot of this kind of data to sift through, there is perhaps an edge to be garnered by really delving into it. So I think some people will do that because there's money to be made from it. I think others will, and probably are also, for their kind of investment style, right to be defensive and to say, well, we don't know what's going to happen here. There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of unpredictability, and there are data issues and analytical issues in processing the data as well in this polling. So we'll just take a step back, and maybe we'll miss some of the percentages in the moves either direction, but that's not our specialty. It's not our expertise, and we'll focus on the bigger picture. And I think we've seen all of that transpire actually in the days leading up to the election and since, right? When we expected the blue wave, we had a big reflation trade on selling treasuries and buying sort of value stocks. And of course, in the event, that has been unwound, or at least substantially reversed, and the yield curve has flattened, and there's been a sector rotation back into growthier and techier kind of sectors of the US and other markets. So a little bit of all of the above.
I mean, it's interesting to hear you say, there's sort of general trends, but obviously the winner of the presidential election will have, big policy impacts. America, sneezes and the world catches a cold economically, but that also applies to policy as well. To an extent, assuming a Biden victory, or just compare, what the likely differences in policy might we see going forwards, that will have a big effect, and over the next 4 years, comparing a potential Biden presidency, which is what we're expecting, to the still possible Trump presidency. I mean, what's going to happen, regarding the market's expectations? I know you just mentioned sort of reflation trade, if there'd been a blue wave and we'd had a Democratic Senate and a Democratic president, but as it seems, we're going to have a Democratic president and a Republican Senate. What's the impact of that on the policy, sort of, foreign policy, foreign and domestic?
Well, so I think these are the kind of the $164 trillion questions, right? So I think first of all, the tone and the rhetoric and the style will change, right? In as much as we had this kind of very disruptive style, and somewhat disruptive, but maybe less disruptive than the style in substance, we'll probably have a more reasonable sort of approach to the rhetoric, to the bully pulpit of the presidency. Instead of having a bully in the pulpit, maybe we're going to have a gentleman in the pulpit. And so there'll be, I think, an effort by the Biden administration to mend fences with allies and partners. Biden himself is a creature of Congress. And so if anyone can work with Mitch McConnell, who looks likely to continue to be, very likely to continue to be, leader of the Senate, the Republican Party in the Senate majority leader, he can, and he has, right, during the Obama administration as vice president and president pro tem of the Senate himself. So I think, that there's a better kind of visage on policy and on policy making and bipartisan politics that's likely, but there will be enormous constraints, right? So the progressives, I think, are waking up to the reality that the United States is not a social democratic country, even, at least not yet, let alone a socialist one, as it's been painted by by President Trump. It's much more centrist, if not center right. And I think that's the message of the Republicans, not only maintaining control of the Senate, but enhancing their position in the House. So I don't think, not only will we not get a big fiscal splurge, we'll have difficulty paying for the unfunded fiscal spending that's already occurred during and before the COVID pandemic with tax increases, right? There are going to be serious fiscal constraints. There'll probably be room to reorient some policy, some preferences there, but the big ideas of 3 trillion, 3.5 trillion fiscal package, that's probably going to be cut at least by a third, if not more. It's still possible that we get a fiscal package in the lame duck session before the new president takes office in the new Congress, and we'll probably get something after that as well, but they're going to be much smaller. And I think that encapsulates the story. The direction will change, but the magnitude will be much less on domestic policy. So there'll be some degree of effort at re-regulation, some degree of reversing a lot of the executive orders of the Trump presidency, but not a major kind of wholesale shift. And I think you'll see that right away in the nomination and approval process. The system will require a system of checks and balances, and the enhanced position of the Republicans in Congress generally and their continuing control of the Senate in particular will prevent the Biden administration from naming cabinet appointees that are progressive, right? They'll have to be centrist, and in some cases they may even have to be center right. So, forget about Elizabeth Warren being Secretary of the Treasury, just to take an extreme example. Much more likely, I guess, to be Lael Brainerd from the Fed, and so on down the line. I think in the international system, we will also see a change of tone and rhetoric and mending fences with allies and partners, particularly in Europe. And I think the Republicans in Congress and in the Senate, in particular, will want to support that, right? I think the problem will be that the rest of the world will be left wondering, what about this American identity crisis, right? What's really going on here? Much as we have an identity crisis of a similar sort, I would argue, right? This is not American exceptionalism. We have this in the UK. We have it in important parts of Western Europe and in many emerging market countries as well, maybe with the possible exception of China. We have a kind of national identity politics, obviously, as the commentariat says, going on. So I think that will induce America's partners and allies to be constructive and open, but limited in their willingness to fully trust the U.S. again. Now, I think, the big question here, the elephant in the room, is the U.S.-China relationship and the relationship between China and many other countries in the West and in emerging markets and in Asia as well. I think the way that will pan out is that it will enforce existing trends. Some countries, particularly in China's neighborhood, will, I think, be more inclined to hedge or even align with China rather than rely on the US. But others, such as Japan, India, South Korea, they'll probably align more politically, geopolitically with the US, and many of them will keep their options economically very open with China. Europe, I think, is already kind of under the table, aligning itself with the US on Huawei and many other issues. I think that will continue with the UK, right? The so-called special relationship is likely to get a boost, so long as there isn't a no-deal Brexit, let's say, that leads to a hard border on the island of Ireland. Joe Biden, of course, is an Irish American himself, and Irish American Catholic votes count for a lot in certain constituencies, which the Democrats will be even more minded to keep. They're solidly Democratic, but they'll have to continue to appeal to that. And so the Good Friday Agreement will need to be honored by all parties concerned. And the US, of course, is a signatory and guarantor, along with the EU and the United Kingdom, of the Good Friday Agreement, and of course, arbitrated the Good Friday Agreement. So that is going to be an important factor in the negotiations and the general negotiations around a free trade deal, as well as the general special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States.
I mean, just moving. I mean, I'm just looking at the time, and we are hastily. You've been very entertaining. I didn't realise how much time we've had. It's been a very informative session. But just before we do finish up, I mean, one of the big almost arguments for Brexit from an economic point of view, but also has been sold as one of the benefits of Brexit, has been the ability for the UK to sign up to a trade deal with the US. Now, that was very, again, rhetorically supported by the Trump administration, but perhaps we didn't see as much movement as the government, the conservative government would have liked. Do we think that things have become more likely? I mean, I know that a big sticking point, is the chlorinated chicken debates and similar things around welfare standards and environmental standards. Has that got a little bit further away or a little bit closer for the UK? And might we see something, obviously the US withdrew from the TPP, but there is a framework there that the Democrats were relatively comfortable with until President Trump came in and withdrew. Is there a framework there that we could perhaps look to base any agreement on?
Well, so I think it's an excellent and very important question. I would suggest that I don't think it makes all that much difference. And the chlorinated chicken, genetically modified foods, that all that kind of debate, I think, is a signifier, right? These are major issues for the UK population. On the US side, you have a serious issue in free trade agreements with many countries, including the EU, including the UK, that a lot of what the Americans cannot do as a federal system is what other countries look for, right? Public procurement in particular, that's a state level matter or a municipal level matter in the US federal state system with the separate powers and so on, much more devolved than many other countries, right? So even if that's, actually a cover for some degree of protectionism, it is a constraint in negotiating all kinds of free trade agreements. And I think those things, so preferences, public preferences and rules that are below or sort of beyond the power of central governments, those are going to stand in the way of a comprehensive free trade agreement. I would say more generally that I think one of the lasting changes of the Trump administration is that, and of Brexit itself, right, is that we have moved from an era of negotiating free trade agreements where the negotiations are about how to take down the barriers to trade and investment by extension, to how do we put them up without being too disruptive to the real economy or the financial market and financial system. And of course, that's essentially the nature of the free trade agreement that the UK is or negotiation that the UK is having with the EU, right? I mean, is it Canada or Australia, right? I mean, put it another way, right? Along the way, Michael Gove said Albania, right? Put it another way, right? These are questions of how much higher are the trade barriers going to be between the UK and the EU. And I think that is what's shifted both rhetorically and in substance in international economic relations compared to the kind of golden age of globalization. And so I think, that's where our sort of emphasis and focus should be is, what is being reduced, not what is being increased, right? And it's kind of an obvious thing to say, but I don't think it gets enough, focus in all of these discussions, is that that's the switch that's occurred. And that, I think, is a structural switch. It's not just about Biden or Johnson or whatever the case may be.
Well, I think that's a brilliant place to end the session. Thank you very much for joining us. That was, I find it very informative and very helpful. I'm sure all of our listeners did as well. Obviously, if anybody does have any questions for us, please, unfortunately, we've run out of time to do them in the chat, but please do drop us an email and we'll make sure that we pass them on to the guys at Invesco, who will be more than happy to make contact. Next week, we'll be looking at the challenges of managing a multi-asset fund during the pandemic, etc. But I think all that really leaves us to say is to thank Arnab for his time and for a very informative session, and to thank everybody for joining us and listening. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me, and thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.